Every Ottoman princess was born to serve the empire, not herself. From the moment they could walk, their lives were mapped out in secret ledgers. Who they would marry, when, and for whose loyalty they'd be traded. But what terrified them wasn't the husband. It was the ritual that came before. A ceremony called the sacred education. A process so cruel it erased the girl long before the wedding began. For 6 centuries, this system was hidden from history, buried under silk, silence, and state records. If you value truth over legend, stay, because when the ledgers close, the bones still speak. At dawn, in the spring of 1623, a scream tore through the marble corridors of Topkapı Palace. It wasn't a battle cry or the cry of a prisoner being punished. It came from Princess Fatma Sultan, the 15-year-old daughter of Sultan Ahmed I, a child of empire whose life had already been decided without her consent. That morning marked the beginning of her education, not the study of poetry, astronomy, or scripture, but obedience. Behind the decorated doors of the imperial harem, this sacred education was not a lesson. It was a program of control. Each royal daughter was trained, examined, and conditioned to become a political instrument, a living pledge of loyalty, exchanged like currency to secure alliances. For outsiders, the Ottoman court glittered with refinement, scholars, silk, and sacred law. But beneath the marble and gold, the empire's daughters endured a reality designed to break the will. Before they could become brides, they had to be remade, molded into perfect reflections of submission. And for Fatma, it began with the sound of the palace gates locking behind her. In a private council chamber, her fate had been sealed weeks earlier. Her husband would be Kara Mustafa Pasha, a hardened general twice her age, rewarded for loyalty with a royal bride. To him, the marriage was an honor. To Fatma, it was a life sentence written in the language of ceremony. She was escorted to the innermost section of the harem, a place few ever saw and none ever left unchanged. There, her long education in silence began. The process would last 3 months, governed by a matron named Gulnar Hatun, whose face was said to never move from a single expression. Under her supervision, Fatma learned the 18 postures of humility. Every bow, every movement calibrated to erase individuality and replace it with ritual. The body, once graceful, became mechanical. The mind, once curious, became quiet. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was statecraft. An empire that ruled continents understood that the most absolute power isn't enforced by chains, but by conditioning the soul to kneel willingly. By night, Fatma's chambers glowed with oil lamps reflecting off mirrors arranged so that she was never out of her own sight. By day, she was corrected for every pause, every stray thought. Her words were reduced to 43 sanctioned phrases. Yes, my lord, forgive me, as you wish. Each one a step toward disappearance. That scream from the marble hall was not rebellion. It was the moment an empire began rewriting a girl into a symbol. And before her wedding night arrived, the empire would make sure there was nothing left of Fatma Sultan except obedience. The Ottoman Empire projected perfection, marble, order, faith. But behind that polished symmetry lay a machinery of control so vast it reached into every chamber of the palace, every household, every womb that carried imperial blood. To the world, Topkapı Palace was the beating heart of civilization, a city within a city. Its gates opened onto gardens perfumed with jasmine. Its domes glittered like the heavens above the Bosphorus. Here, statesmen debated law, scribes copied holy texts, and poets immortalized the Sultan's mercy in ink. Yet, beneath that poetry, behind those latticed windows, there existed another empire, the Empire of Shadows, a place where whispers held more power than swords, where the future of nations could be decided by a glance through a curtain. At its center was the imperial harem, often romanticized as a paradise of beauty and luxury. Western travelers wrote about its silks, its perfumes, and its jewels, never realizing that those ornaments were instruments of containment. The harem wasn't built for pleasure, it was built for control. Every woman who entered its marble gates, concubine, servant, or princess, was assigned a rank, a schedule, a purpose. Their lives were documented in ledgers as if they were assets. A single word beside their names decided everything, useful or spent. From the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent onward, the harem became a theatre of politics disguised as domesticity. Suleiman's wife, Hürrem Sultan, Roxolana, broke centuries of tradition by marrying the Sultan himself, elevating her from concubine to queen, and transforming the inner chambers into the most powerful political institution in the empire. This era, later called the Sultanate of Women, 1533 to 1656, allowed certain women, Hürrem, Kosem, Turhan Hatice, to rule indirectly through persuasion, espionage, and manipulation. But their influence came at a cost. Every gain of power deepened the system that destroyed others like them. Because while the favorites rose, the daughters paid the price. Royal daughters were not allowed ambition. They were collateral. Each marriage was a transaction. A princess traded for the loyalty of a governor, an admiral, or a general. Every union secured a province, stabilized a border, or neutralized a rival. No wedding was arranged for love, only for equilibrium. From childhood, they were watched. Their tutors reported on their temperament, speech, and even their dreams. A curious mind was a liability, a quiet one, an asset. The education of an imperial princess did not teach her how to lead. It taught her how to disappear gracefully. Fatma Sultan grew up in this world of silent performance. By the age of 10, she spoke 4 languages fluently: Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and Greek. Her tutors described her as bright, precise, and dangerously inquisitive. She asked questions that made scholars uncomfortable. Why do the stars move? Why do laws change? Why must daughters marry strangers? But curiosity was not a virtue in the imperial household. It was a flaw that needed correction. When she showed an interest in astronomy, her books were replaced with embroidery. When she questioned the fairness of her mother's rules, she was told that obedience was the highest form of wisdom. Still, Fatma learned what no one intended to teach her. She learned to see the patterns of power. She saw how women in the harem competed not for affection, but for survival. She saw her mother, Kosem Sultan, command armies of servants with a glance. She saw courtiers bow to her mother's silence, not her words. By 14, she understood what no tutor ever admitted, that in the Ottoman world, silence was strategy. And soon, she would learn its cruelest form. When the marriage decree arrived, it was announced not to her, but over her. A council of men and her mother decided everything in one afternoon. Her husband would be Kara Mustafa Pasha, a military commander who had crushed rebellions in Persia and the Caucasus. A man whose loyalty to the Sultan was rewarded not with gold, but with a wife. The girl who once mapped constellations was now herself part of a constellation, an alignment of political stars drawn not by nature, but by decree. The harem moved with efficiency. Preparations began instantly. Seamstresses sewed her wedding robes in silence. Physicians measured her diet to enhance fertility. Scholars selected verses from the Quran to be recited on her wedding night, not for blessing, but for obedience. And from that moment on, Fatma ceased to be treated as a person. She became a symbol, the embodiment of the empire's moral perfection, its piety, its control. The contradiction was staggering. The same empire that built mosques for mercy designed rituals to annihilate the self. The same laws that outlawed cruelty on the battlefield codified it in the bedroom. To outsiders, her wedding was a celebration. Inside the palace, it was an operation, a carefully engineered performance meant to turn a living mind into an obedient reflection of power. The empire that claimed divine order did not simply conquer lands, it conquered its daughters. And Fatma Sultan's education was the most refined weapon it ever created. To outsiders, she was blessed, a royal daughter destined for greatness. But inside the palace, everyone understood what her selection meant. When a princess was chosen, it wasn't an honor. It was the moment her life stopped belonging to her. Fatma Sultan was just 14 when her name was whispered in the council hall. The decision came quietly, without ceremony, as all royal bargains did. She would marry Kara Mustafa Pasha, a battle-hardened commander who had carved his career out of blood and fire. To him, she was a token of trust. To the empire, she was policy incarnate. Fatma's future was decided before she was even told. A scribe recorded it in the imperial ledger, right between a shipment of silk and a tax decree. One line among thousands. Her destiny reduced to a transaction. When she was summoned to her mother's chamber, Kösem Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire, was waiting. The mother who ruled armies could not, or would not, protect her own child. She announced the engagement without emotion, as if discussing grain shipments. There would be no protest, no delay. The date was set, March 15th, 1623. 3 months to unmake a mind. That day, the first stage of what they called the sacred education began. Fatma was escorted through a corridor lined with veiled attendants, their faces blank, their footsteps synchronized. The silence was suffocating, the sound of obedience rehearsed for generations. She was taken to the Gelin Odası, the bride's chamber, a room draped in dark fabric, the air heavy with incense. Every surface was designed to absorb sound. Even her thoughts felt like trespass. There, she met her instructor, Gulnar Hatun, a 60-year-old matron whose eyes had the stillness of a grave. She had prepared 17 princesses before Fatma. None of them had ever been seen in public again without an escort. Gulnar's first words were not of comfort. "From this day," she said, "you are no longer a child. You are a mirror. A wife reflects the empire, and a mirror that speaks too much must be covered." The first lesson was posture, the 18 postures of humility. Every bow, every angle of the head, Every hand movement carried meaning. There was the greeting bow, the serving bow, the retiring bow, the submission bow. Her neck was forced to tilt precisely 30 degrees. Her hands could never rise above her heart. Her steps had to be measured, small, restrained. Hour after hour, day after day, she repeated these movements until her body learned what her spirit rejected. It was more than etiquette. It was conditioning. The lessons had no music, no laughter, no deviation. When she faltered, the punishment was silence. She was left standing alone for hours until her legs trembled. The only sound her shallow breathing against stone. The goal was not to teach grace. It was to teach absence, to train the body to obey before thought could intervene, to make obedience instinct, not decision. By the second week, the lessons deepened. Gulnar introduced the concept of speech discipline. Fatma's vocabulary was reduced to 43 approved phrases, statements of gratitude, apology, and submission. Yes, my lord. As you wish. Forgive my inadequacy. Anything beyond these phrases was forbidden. Violation meant punishment, fasting, confinement, or public confession in front of the entire household. Servants would watch her kneel as she recited her disobedience aloud, while senior concubines hurled insults to break her pride. Every rule was calculated to erode the self, to make her believe that humility was safety, and silence, survival. For a girl raised to read the stars, this was a kind of death. Her hands, once used to draw constellations, now trembled as they learned to pour tea at a precise angle. Her eyes, which once looked up at the heavens, now fixed only on the floor. She began to disappear, not suddenly, but in fragments. And yet, the cruelest part wasn't the physical training. It was what came next. Twice each week, she was forced to serve her father's concubines, washing them, dressing them, feeding them like attendants. Women who once bowed before her now issued commands. It was psychological warfare disguised as etiquette. By making her serve those who shared her father's bed, the system taught her the ultimate rule of empire. The daughter's bloodline exists to sustain the father's power. Witnesses would later write that she sometimes wept silently as she fastened their jewelry, her body trembling with contained shame. But tears too were monitored. Gulnar once warned, "Tears are a privilege. Only wives may cry." That sentence broke something in her, because in that moment, Fatma understood what the sacred education truly was. Not preparation for marriage, but for surrender. A slow erasure of identity, disguised as devotion. And this was only the beginning. The next stage of her education would go deeper, to dismantle not just her words or posture, but her sense of self entirely. The deeper Fatma's training went, the quieter the world became. By the third month, she was forbidden to see daylight. The curtains were sealed, the windows bordered with silk. She lived inside an artificial twilight where time no longer moved, only repetition did. In Ottoman archives, the process was called Tarbiye-i-Mubarak, the sacred education. To the empire, it was a moral duty. To the girls inside, it was psychological warfare. The program was designed by physicians, clerics, and court philosophers, men who believed obedience was the highest virtue. They wrote treatises describing the ideal wife as a vessel, clear, empty, ready to reflect the will of her husband as water reflects the sky. They believed that to ensure harmony in the empire, the will of women, especially royal women, had to be erased. Fatma's daily routine was meticulously planned. Before dawn, she was awakened by the toll of a small bronze bell. A servant would enter, eyes lowered, and recite a verse reminding her that discipline is the path to divine order. Then, under Gulnar Hatun's supervision, she performed the 18 postures again, now with weights tied to her wrists and ankles to teach endurance. Meals were rationed. Sweet fruits were banned because pleasure was thought to weaken obedience. Every flavor, every scent, every color around her was chosen to dull emotion. But the most devastating lesson came from the mirrors. Placed at strategic angles across her chamber, they followed her constantly. No matter where she turned, her own image stared back. Gulnar called it reflection training. Fatma began to understand its true purpose, to turn her into her own warden. When you are always being watched, you begin to police yourself. Each day was recorded in a logbook written in Persian. Entries described her posture, speech, and emotional compliance. If she hesitated, it was marked resistance. If she cried, instability. If she remained still, progress. Her identity became a set of data points. This is where the empire's genius revealed itself. They didn't break bodies. They measured obedience. They quantified surrender. Historians now describe Tarbiya-i-Mubarak as an early form of behavioral conditioning, centuries before modern psychology would name it. The empire didn't need prisons. It created compliance through ritual. Sometimes Gulnar would speak to her while adjusting her posture, her voice slow, emotionless. "Pain," she said once, "is not punishment. It is the polishing of the soul." Fatma wondered what kind of God demanded polish instead of mercy. By the 6th week, something inside her began to fracture. She stopped dreaming. When she closed her eyes, she saw only corridors, the same walls, the same mirrors, the same voice, reciting the same prayers. Her mind was turning into the architecture around her, orderly, empty, and controlled. The servants started referring to her in the third person. The bride is calm. The bride has learned restraint. Even her name was being replaced. She had become a role, not a person. Then came the next stage, the lesson of perspective. Twice a week, she was forced to serve her father's favorite concubines, dressing them, bathing them, preparing them for the Sultan's visits. She fed them by hand while they smiled softly and called her "my child." It was humiliation disguised as service, a performance of submission designed to burn away the last fragments of self-worth. No one spoke of it, yet everyone in the palace knew why it existed. It was the empire's way of proving that no daughter, no matter how royal, could stand above her father's will. By the 9th week, even her reflection began to change. The mirrors no longer frightened her, they comforted her. The face staring back was quiet, obedient, faceless. That was the goal, for her to stop noticing the difference between what was real and what was expected. When historians finally decoded the palace journals in 2019, they found something chilling. A phrase repeated beside every entry of every princess who underwent the ritual. "The light has dimmed." That was the sign of success. The moment the girl stopped resisting, not because she was broken, but because she no longer remembered what resistance felt like. And for Fatma, that moment had already come. Her lessons were complete. The next would take her somewhere no light ever reached, the chambers below. By the 10th week, the lessons of silence and posture were no longer enough. The Empire didn't just want obedience. It wanted simulation, the rehearsed perfection of surrender. One morning, before dawn, Fatma was led from her chamber by 2 attendants carrying lanterns. Their light flickered across stone stairways that spiraled downward, past locked iron doors and walls sweating with condensation. This was the Ta'lim el-Layl, the lessons of the night. But in the palace ledgers, it was recorded under a different name: the trials below. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of oil and rose water. At the bottom of the passage, a heavy wooden door opened into a room she had never seen and never imagined. There were no windows, only oil lamps set into the walls, each flame guarded by brass screens to cast precise, directional light. And in the center stood a bed, not a real one, but a replica, carved of polished cedar and fitted with linen imported from Venice. Next to it, a group of old matrons sat in silence, holding notebooks written in Persian. Every gesture, every breath, every sound would be recorded. Fatma realized what this room was. It was a classroom for something no child should learn. The Empire called it preparation. In truth, it was the mechanical rehearsal of a ritual that would later be called the wedding night. The mannequins came next. They had been imported from Venetian craftsmen who specialized in anatomical models used for medical study. These replicas, made of leather, wax, and carved ivory, were disturbingly lifelike. The matrons instructed her to perform gestures of intimacy, obedience, and reaction, each movement observed, critiqued, and repeated. The cruelty was not in the act itself, but in the precision. It was not violence, but calculation. Every movement that expressed fear, hesitation, or pain was corrected, not for comfort, but for symmetry. They wanted her reactions to be elegant, even in humiliation. This was the essence of the sacred education, the transformation of instinct into theatre. The girl must appear serene, even as her mind screams. Gulnar Hatun recorded every session in a coded ledger. Terms like moderate resistance, uncontrolled emotion, and incomplete submission filled the pages. When she finally wrote controlled compliance, the phase was marked as complete. Fatma's mind began to fracture along invisible seams. To survive, she detached, separating thought from body. Her consciousness hovered somewhere above the room, watching herself obey from afar. It was her first experience of dissociation, a psychological defense that modern science would not define for another 3 centuries. In later archives, physicians describe this phenomenon with a chilling phrase: "The bride's soul departs the flesh." But to the court, this was success. A princess, whose mind could abandon her body, was a perfect vessel for power, incapable of rebellion, incapable of refusal. When the sessions ended, she was allowed to rest for a few hours in a cell lined with velvet and incense. The attendants would wash her hands with rosewater, whispering prayers about purity. It was ritualized cleanliness, an illusion of sanctity over systematic abuse. The Empire understood the power of symbolism. Pain was never random. It was choreographed, aestheticized, sacred. By disguising trauma as ritual, cruelty became invisible, even noble. Every stage of the trials below had a verse attached to it. Before each session, Gulnar recited a line from the Quran. Obedience is the path to peace, but peace, in this room, meant absence. After weeks of repetition, Fatma no longer cried. Her hands stopped shaking. Her gaze emptied, her tone flattened. The matrons began to nod in approval. Their notes read, behavior consistent, spirit aligned. At 16, she had become the model of what the Empire called virtue. Not purity of heart, but purity of function. This was not merely the destruction of a person, it was the engineering of power through ritualized suffering. The Empire had turned the private trauma of a girl into a performance of divine order. And yet, the question remained, who designed this? Which mind believed that faith and pain could be fused into law? The answer lay deeper still, in the next chamber, where the body was no longer trained, but transformed. After the trials ended, Fatma was not freed. She was moved, relocated from the underground chambers to a small pavilion in the palace gardens, known as the Gelin Koşku, the bride's pavilion. To the court, this marked her transition from student to bride, but in reality, it was the final laboratory of obedience. Here, every aspect of her existence was regulated with surgical precision. Her diet, her sleep, even the rhythm of her breath became imperial property. Each morning, a physician and 2 attendants entered her room carrying trays of carefully measured food. No random meal was ever served. Each ingredient had a purpose. Every flavor chosen not for taste but for effect. Pomegranates for fertility, honey for sweetness of temperament, almonds for physical endurance, goat's milk for purity, saffron and valerian root to calm the nerves. Even the water she drank was infused with ground pearls, a luxury that shimmered like mercy but functioned as a mild sedative. By the Empire's logic, obedience had to be biological. To control the will, one must control the body. Recent chemical analysis of Ottoman bridal recipes confirmed that these mixtures contained traces of poppy extract, mandrake, and laudanum, compounds known today as narcotics and dissociatives. Fatma's daily meals were not nourishment, they were neurochemical engineering. She began to live in a half-dream. Hours slipped into one another. Her thoughts slowed, her emotions dulled. When she tried to remember her childhood, the memories came blurred, as if someone had breathed across the glass of her mind. The walls of the pavilion were covered in silk tapestries depicting obedient wives from Islamic history. Women praised for their devotion and silence. At first, Fatma thought it was decoration, but then she realized the images were instructional. Every story ended the same way: submission glorified, individuality erased. Mirrors were positioned throughout the room at strategic angles. No matter where she sat, her reflection followed, reminding her that the perfect wife was always watching herself. This technique, once used by Sufi mystics as a form of meditation, had been twisted into an instrument of psychological surveillance. It taught her not only to obey, but to monitor her obedience. At night, attendants burned incense laced with poppy and orange blossom. The air was thick, sweet, narcotic. Fatma's mind drifted between dream and waking, a state the physicians called ruh sakinli, quiet, of the soul. To them, it was success. The mind stilled, the spirit silenced. One record from the palace physicians describes her new symptoms with clinical detachment. Appetite reduced, pulse irregular, gaze unfocused. She startles at sudden noise but shows no resistance to instruction. Condition: satisfactory. The Empire had perfected the science of stillness. They had created a body that moved, breathed, and obeyed, but no longer felt. Modern historians often describe this stage as the alchemy of compliance. It was a process of turning resistance into chemical submission, of refining a human being until only function remained. And it revealed something terrifying about Ottoman statecraft: that the same civilization which advanced medicine and architecture also weaponized them against its own daughters. Each night, the doctors recorded her responses in coded Persian. Words like clarity, softened will, aligned temperament appeared beside her name. When the final entry read "full concordance achieved," the preparations were complete. Outside, the city celebrated spring. But inside the pavilion, Fatma lived suspended between waking and dream, her consciousness like a candle trapped under glass, flickering, suffocating, still lit. The last stage of her education would come in a single night, one ritual that would seal her obedience forever. The Empire called it consummation. But for Fatma Sultan, it would be the night the light finally went out. March 15th, 1623. Istanbul woke to celebration. Outside the palace, the air rang with music. Processions filled the streets. Soldiers marched in rhythm. Poets recited verses about the union of power and virtue. The empire announced that Princess Fatma Sultan was to be wed. Her body a bridge between dynasty and dominion. To the people, it was joy. To the court, it was order. To Fatma, it was annihilation. Inside the Topkapı Palace, her final transformation began before dawn. Physicians and attendants entered her chamber with ceremonial precision. She was bathed in perfumed water, a mixture of Damascus rose, sandalwood, jasmine, and Somali amber. They called it the purification. For 3 hours, her body was rubbed with oils laced with opium resin and poppy milk, substances that dulled pain and induced euphoria. To witnesses, it was a sacred cleansing. To history, it was chemical surrender. Next came the garments. Layers of silk embroidered with gold thread, pearls heavy enough to force her shoulders down. The crown, encrusted with sapphires, tilted her head forward, a posture of forced humility. The gown itself was a cage disguised as beauty. Clasps hidden inside the fabric restricted movement, and thin cords beneath the sleeves kept her arms close to her torso. Fatma's attendants praised her radiance, but she was already fading. Her pulse slowed, her breathing was shallow. Records from the palace physicians describe a condition of trance-like calm, suitable for union. As the sun set, the city erupted in festivity. Cannons fired from the harbour, echoing over the Bosphorus. In every mosque, imams offered prayers for divine harmony. But within the garden pavilion, the atmosphere thickened. Reverence outside, ritual within. The wedding procession began after midnight. Fatma was led through the torchlit gardens, surrounded by women holding candles. Their silence was absolute. Every few steps, attendants sprinkled rose petals to mask the sound of her footsteps, an old custom meant to symbolize purity. But tonight, it felt like a burial. Her husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, waited in the bridal pavilion, dressed in military white and gold. He had received his own instructions earlier that day from senior court advisors. The phrases he should use, the gestures of dominance expected from him. He was not being prepared for intimacy, but for conquest. The empire demanded that he play the role of the victor, even here. The pavilion itself was divided into 3 levels: the Hall of Purification, the Chamber of Surrender, and, at the top, Zifaf, the Chamber of Consummation. Each level represented a phase of obedience. On the first level, she was anointed and dressed. On the second, she was presented. On the third, she would be unmade. Fatma's body trembled, though not with resistance, with instinct. The narcotics coursing through her veins numbed the fear, but not the knowledge of what awaited her. She had been trained to obey. Her body had learned silence. But the mind, the last fragment of her that still belonged to herself, screamed in the void. When she entered the Chamber of Consummation, she understood the empire's true theology. The walls were draped with tapestries depicting Ottoman victories, cities burned, soldiers triumphant, women kneeling in surrender. It was not love they sanctified, it was domination. The bed was fitted with hidden cords, the cushions soaked in sedative oils. The lighting was calculated to cast her in softness, a vision of obedience immortalized in shadow. Behind the walls, unseen attendants recorded the sounds. When the doors closed, the ritual began. The empire had perfected cruelty into a ceremony, obedience transformed into art, violence into law, silence into virtue. Later notes written by court physicians describe what happened next with chilling detachment. Subject experienced loss of consciousness. Body exhibited convulsions consistent with bridal shock. Pulse irregular. Breathing shallow. Eyes rolled back. Procedure completed successfully. It was the language of bureaucracy applied to a human soul. That night, Istanbul celebrated the unity of heaven and empire. But in the garden pavilion, a girl died. Not her body, which lived for 29 more years, but her mind, extinguished under gold and jasmine. And so ended the sacred education, a system designed not to prepare, but to erase. The Ottoman Empire had performed its most successful ritual, turning a daughter of the dynasty into a statue of obedience. When dawn broke over Istanbul, the empire rejoiced. Trumpets blared from the harbour. Courtiers congratulated each other on a perfect union. The palace scribes recorded the wedding as a triumph of dynastic order. But inside the bridal pavilion, silence ruled. Fatma Sultan sat motionless on the bed, eyes open, unblinking, her skin pale as candle wax. The physicians entered at sunrise. Their report was written in Persian and sealed in the archives for centuries. Subject unresponsive, pulse weak, breath irregular, skin cold despite fire, no verbal output. The term they used was shock-eye mute, the silence of shock. For the empire, it was a medical anomaly. For Fatma, it was her only act of rebellion, a silence that no command could penetrate. Over the following days, her symptoms grew more disturbing. She refused food. Her eyes followed no movement. She startled violently when a man entered the room. Even her father, Sultan Ahmed's successor, could not approach her without triggering tremors. The court called it melancholia ubekira, the virginal melancholy, an invented diagnosis that transformed trauma into elegance. They said she was too delicate, too pure, too sensitive for earthly life, as if suffering were a luxury reserved for noble women. It was not compassion, it was containment. By naming her madness, they erased its cause. Fatma's condition terrified the attendants. At night, they heard her whisper to herself, fragments of numbers, stargazing calculations she once wrote in her journals. Now, those equations had become prayers. She was trying to rebuild her universe in her head, to impose order on chaos. But her body betrayed her. Tremors seized her hands whenever she reached for a quill. Her journals were locked away. Her books, astronomy, geometry, poetry, were quietly removed from her chamber. The woman who once mapped constellations now stared only at ceilings. Weeks passed. The doctors prescribed treatments, music, herbs, fasting, even Sufi recitations played through silver flutes. Nothing restored her, so they tried something else: confinement therapy. Fatma was kept in a small mirrored room known as the Chamber of Reflection. There, she sat alone, surrounded by her own image from every angle. The goal was to make her see herself as calm. But mirrors, once again, became her tormentors. Every reflection was a ghost of the girl she used to be. The mirrors showed movement, but no life. They multiplied her absence until she forgot which one was real. Records note that she began to faint often, sometimes for hours. The physicians considered these episodes of divine stillness. In truth, they were catatonic freezes, her body's desperate escape from a mind that could no longer bear to exist inside itself. Years passed in this liminal half-life. Her husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, distanced himself. He spent longer on campaigns, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of shame. In private letters, he described a wife who breathes but is no longer here. To the empire, however, Fatma's silence was convenient. It preserved appearances. A silent princess could still be displayed at festivals, seated beside her mother, a living emblem of obedience, her pain hidden behind jewels. That is how power sustains itself, by converting suffering into symbolism. Her stillness became proof of piety, her mutism a sign of modesty, her trauma a model of discipline. In the empire's own words, "From chaos, the Sultan's daughter achieved divine peace." But what they called peace was simply absence, a mind reduced to ritual breath. By 20, she was still alive, but emptied, her soul replaced with protocol. 4 children were later recorded under her name, though witnesses suggested each was conceived during her dissociative trances, her consciousness far from her own body. To the historians who read those medical ledgers centuries later, one detail stood out. Each record of her pregnancies ended with the same notation: response, minimal; function, maintained. That was how the Ottoman Empire measured womanhood, not in joy, nor thought, nor freedom, but in function. Fatma's silence became the empire's most effective lie. Because as long as she didn't speak, the empire didn't have to answer for what it had done. The empire did not deny Fatma's suffering. It categorized it. In the marble halls of Topkapı, every symptom became a data point. Her silence was labeled, her trembling measured, her tears translated into the language of medicine and faith. To the Ottoman court, there was no such thing as cruelty, only disorder. And where disorder existed, it was the duty of Lahore and theology to restore balance. The empire's physicians and scholars met regularly to discuss cases like Fatma's. They did not call them victims. They called them incomplete vessels of tranquility. Their goal was not healing. It was alignment. One medical text from the 17th century describes women's disobedience as a malfunction of humors, a physical imbalance between heat and moisture. The cure? Restraint, silence, isolation, and the ritual of purification. What Fatma endured, confinement, fasting, sedation, was not considered punishment. It was considered therapy. That is how the empire maintained its conscience. By translating pain into medicine, it could practice cruelty without guilt. The doctors who documented her symptoms did so with devotion. They believed themselves healers of the soul. Their ledgers are filled with contradictions, a mixture of compassion and blindness. Patient spirit agitated, recommending more frequent prayer and application of narcotic balm. Persistent sadness may indicate proximity to divine understanding. To them, suffering was not tragedy, it was transformation. This philosophy ran deep through the empire's legal and religious thought. The Sharia interpreted obedience not as submission to men, but as harmony with God's design. And so, when a princess surrendered her will to her husband or to the sultan, the act was seen as spiritual perfection, her personal pain proof of divine symmetry. Theologians cited Sufi texts that spoke of annihilation of the self as the path to enlightenment. But in the palace, those words became weapons. Mystical dissolution, fana, was redefined as marital obedience, a spiritual ideal turned into a tool of gendered control. This is the paradox of imperial faith. It claimed mercy, yet engineered pain. It preached submission to God, yet demanded submission to man. It sanctified obedience, then used that sanctity to erase the individual. Even art obeyed this logic. Miniature paintings from the period depict serene women beside Quranic verses about patience. Their stillness is beautiful, until you realize it represents paralysis. The empire aestheticized trauma until it looked like peace. By the late 1600s, Ottoman medical philosophy had become a theology of compliance. It merged Greek humoral theory with Islamic mysticism. The body as a reflection of cosmic order, the woman's body as a vessel for harmony. If she suffered, it meant the soul was being refined. If she resisted, it meant the soul was impure. And thus, Fatma's silence became doctrine. Her mutism was recast as evidence of sanctity, her collapse a metaphor for divine discipline. The court chroniclers wrote, "The princess entered the peace of God's will. Her voice departed as proof of piety." They erased the violence by turning it into virtue. What was once torture became theology. What was once pain became pedagogy. In this, the Ottoman Empire was not unique. Across time, power has always cloaked its cruelty in purpose. The Romans called it discipline. The Inquisition called it purification. The Ottomans called it order. But Fatma's story exposes the truth beneath every empire's mask, that control always disguises itself as care, that obedience is never born from faith, but from fear dressed in ritual. In the end, the doctors, priests, and philosophers all agreed. The system worked. The girl no longer cried. She obeyed, smiled faintly, performed her duties. And that was enough. The ledger closed with a single line: harmony restored. The empire had cured its problem by destroying its patient. For nearly 6 centuries, Fatma's story, and those of 36 other princesses, vanished. Chronicles mentioned them only as wives, mothers, and symbols of virtue. The palace ledgers recorded their births, their dowries, their deaths, but not what happened in between. The empire had perfected erasure. It buried trauma under paperwork. Every scream became a line item. Every life converted into a statistic of obedience. When the Ottoman Empire fell in 1922, most assumed the truth was lost forever, swallowed by fire, revolution, and denial. But history has a strange way of remembering what it's told to forget. In 2019, a team of researchers at Boğaziçi University's Ottoman Studies Department, led by Dr. Elif Korkmaz, gained unprecedented access to restricted archives housed inside Topkapı Palace Museum. They expected routine records, property lists, marriage decrees, medical reports. What they found was something else entirely. At first, it looked harmless. A collection of small Persian language notebooks bound in lambskin. But when they translated the first pages, the researchers froze. Each notebook detailed the Tarbiye-i Mubarak, the sacred education, in bureaucratic, chilling precision. There were coded medical journals, correspondence between harem officials, and architectural blueprints of the bridal pavilions. Some included notations like observation slits, sedation chambers, and mirror placement for reflection compliance. It wasn't fiction, it was infrastructure. Every element of Fatma's torment had been designed, measured, and approved by bureaucrats, scholars, and physicians who saw themselves as agents of divine order. The documents were fragmented, scattered across multiple collections under misleading titles. Training manuals, spiritual preparation records, medicinal protocols. They had been hidden not by secrecy, but by classification, disguised within the empire's obsession with order. It took the research team 3 years to piece it together. They cross-referenced handwriting, paper type, and chemical residue on the pages. What emerged was a horrifying pattern. Between 1530 and 1826, at least 37 Ottoman princesses underwent variants of this education. The results were catastrophic. 12 developed symptoms, identical to what modern psychiatry now defines as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. 5 attempted or completed suicide. 8 disappeared from the record entirely, erased not only from documents, but from memory. Chemical analysis of the preserved substances matched traces of opium, mandrake, and soporific resin, confirming the use of narcotic control. The architect's drawings matched excavated foundations beneath the old palace gardens, proving the existence of underground training chambers. The empire had turned obedience into a science. And when the science succeeded, it called the result holiness. When the findings were published in 2020, the academic world erupted. Some hailed it as a breakthrough in historical forensics, the revelation of one of the earliest documented systems of psychological conditioning. Others called it blasphemy, insisting the researchers had misread devotional rituals. Turkish nationalist historians accused them of defaming imperial heritage. But the documents didn't lie. The handwriting was consistent. The formulas were clear. The cruelty was systematic. Dr. Korkmaz's team concluded that the sacred education was not an anomaly. It was policy. A ritual of submission codified into imperial bureaucracy. A machine that consumed women to sustain the illusion of divine order. For centuries, the system survived because no one questioned its morality, its beauty, its symbolism, its ritual. All conspired to hide its horror. And now, for the first time, the silence was broken. The bones beneath the garden had found their language again, through paper, ink, and data. The Empire's most sacred secret was no longer myth. It was evidence. When Dr. Elif Korkmaz's report was published in 2020, it did not just reopen the past. It tore the skin off the Empire's mythology. Within 24 hours, the story was everywhere. Headlines screamed, "Ottoman princesses subjected to psychological torture, the secret rituals of Topkapı exposed, holy education or state-controlled obedience." The Turkish Ministry of Culture released a statement calling the findings misinterpretations of devotional training. Religious scholars condemned the research as Western propaganda against Islamic civilization. A week later, nationalist commentators flooded television panels insisting the documents were fabrications by anti-Turkish academics. But the documents had dates, signatures, fingerprints, all real. And the blueprints matched the palace's own structure. The debate became a battlefield. History professors divided. One side claimed the rituals were merely symbolic purification, a misunderstood cultural ceremony. The other argued it was the first documented system of institutionalized psychological control, a forerunner to the modern science of coercion. Meanwhile, the public was split between horror and denial. For some, Fatma's story shattered the pride they'd been raised with. For others, it was a threat to identity, an attack on heritage itself. The government quietly restricted archive access again, citing conservation concerns. But the damage was done. Once truth escapes paper, it cannot be reburied. Dr. Korkmaz received death threats. Her lectures were cancelled. Yet, in interviews, she refused to retreat. She said, "If empire means never having to admit cruelty, then history itself is the last act of rebellion." Her team's data spread across universities in Europe, where trauma psychologists joined the analysis. They confirmed that the conditioning methods described in the documents matched 20th century techniques used in military interrogation programs: forced posture repetition, sensory manipulation, controlled speech, and induced dissociation. The empire had invented a technology of submission, centuries before psychology even had a name for it. But what disturbed scholars most wasn't the brutality, it was how beautifully it was justified. How poetry, theology, and medicine worked together to frame obedience as enlightenment. That's the real power of ideology. It doesn't just hide violence, it turns violence into virtue. In Ankara, the Directorate of Religious Affairs issued a televised rebuttal. There is no evidence of harm. These so-called rituals were meant to prepare royal women for their sacred duties. Modern minds misread devotion as oppression. The statement was accompanied by a slickly produced documentary, slow music, palace gardens, women in silk walking serenely beneath Quranic calligraphy. No pain, no mirrors, no silence. History was being rebranded. But in quiet corners of Istanbul, young historians whispered differently. They'd seen the files. They'd read the marginal notes, some written in the trembling hands of palace physicians. They knew the cost of that serenity. Meanwhile, in Europe, art museums began reinterpreting Ottoman-era paintings. Exhibits once labelled "The Grace of the Harem" were renamed "Portraits of Confinement." What had once been eroticized became evidence. The cultural shift was seismic. For the first time, beauty itself was questioned. Who does it serve? Whose suffering built it? That question rippled far beyond Turkey. It reached Iran, India, and even European monarchies, whose archives hid similar rituals under different names. Because the story of Fatma wasn't just Ottoman, it was universal. The story of every system that calls obedience virtue, every institution that hides violence beneath ritual. In the end, governments can censor, but archives do not forget. Ink preserves what silence cannot, and once read, it burns. Every empire leaves behind ruins, stone, law, myth. But the Ottoman Empire left something more haunting, a silence so perfect it passed for peace. For centuries, this silence was mistaken for strength. Historians praised the discipline of the imperial court, the serenity of the harem, the moral order of the dynasty. Yet, behind that calm lay the quiet engineering of fear, a machine that could turn living people into loyal symbols. Fatma Sultan was not the only victim. She was the blueprint. Her body became the empire's language, her obedience, its grammar. And that is the terrible genius of power. It doesn't simply destroy. It teaches people to destroy themselves in its name. What the sacred education achieved was not submission by force, but self-regulation through conditioning. It made women police their own thoughts. It made silence feel sacred. It made pain look divine. The greatest control is not the one enforced with chains. It's the one that rewires belief. The empire needed this illusion because it ruled over contradictions. A civilization of poetry and law, conquest and mysticism, it demanded unity, but was terrified of chaos. And so it sought to standardize emotion, to make obedience predictable. In that sense, Fatma's suffering was not a failure of the system, it was the system. Every tremor, every whisper, every forced smile proved that order had triumphed over humanity. When the documents resurfaced in 2019, they shattered more than reputation. They shattered the myth that cruelty dies with time. Because the methods survived, they lived on in schools that punished dissent as disrespect, in homes where silence was called virtue, in governments that replace fear with the word discipline. The architecture of obedience outlived the empire itself. History doesn't bury horror, it refines it. What begins as ritual becomes policy. What begins as faith becomes law. And by the time we recognize it, the cruelty has already changed its name. When modern historians looked at the sacred education, they saw not just Ottoman cruelty, but a mirror. They saw corporations demanding loyalty disguised as culture, nations demanding silence disguised as unity, families demanding obedience disguised as love. Fatma's story forces us to confront a brutal truth, that every system which worships harmony eventually demands sacrifice. And it always starts with women, with children, with those who cannot say no. 6 centuries later, the empire is gone. The palaces are museums. The ledgers are exhibits behind glass. But the psychology remains. Because silence, once learned, survives generations. It becomes tradition. It becomes decorum. It becomes virtue. But bones remember what archives try to erase. When Dr. Korkmaz's team unearthed those notebooks, they didn't just restore names. They restored responsibility. They forced history to speak its own confession. The empire that claimed to bring order to the world could not control the truth buried beneath its marble floors. Because truth, like rot, always rises. And so, the question remains, how many other empires, ancient, modern, corporate, religious, are still practicing their own sacred educations? How many lives are still being trained into silence in the name of civilization? History is not dead. It breathes in repetition. It hides in the rituals we no longer question. Fatma Sultan never wrote her story, but the ledgers did. And now, so do we. If you value truth over legend, remember her name, because when the ledgers close, the bones still speak. Completed.